The Department of English and Comparative Literature is honored with the visit of Professor Ronald Strickland, who is the Chair of Humanities in Michigan Tech University, United States. I think I should, before formally welcoming Professor Ronald Strickland, I should introduce him with a few words. He has come here with Professor Beatrice Smith, who is also in the Department of Linguistics at Michigan Tech University. She is sitting over there. Let us welcome Professor Ronald Strickland and Professor Beatrice Smith together to the Department of English and Comparative Literature on behalf of all of us. Professor Ronald Strickland is known for his extremely brilliant lectures, and some of his lectures are actually available on the YouTube. And he is an expert in critical theory, postmodernism, culture studies. He was a Fulbright senior specialist in Moldova State University, Moldova. And he also was awarded the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2005. He was also an outstanding university. He won the Outstanding University Teacher Award from the Illinois State University in 1996. So I'm sure you are going to enjoy his lecture. As we know, postmodernism is no more probably a buzzword, or it has become, in some quarters at least, a kind of unfashionable term. See, we have been celebrating, or most of the Western academia, also the academia in India, had been celebrating the end of history thesis, the thesis on the incredulity towards meta-narratives, and so on and so forth, death of the subject and so on. But still, I think for me, another kind of grand narrative is again making a powerful comeback these days. So let us all listen to Professor Ronald Strickland, how he is actually going to engage postmodernism, and also let us ask a lot of questions of Professor Ronald Strickland. I extend my deep and warm welcome on behalf of the Department of English and Comparative Literature and the Center for Theory and Criticism. I warmly welcome Professor Ronald Strickland. Let us all welcome him, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Panyan, for that very gracious introduction. I had forgotten some of those things myself, so it's good to be reminded. And that's not the only reason why I'm so happy to be here today. I always look forward to these kinds of events as learning opportunities, so I'm eager to learn what I can from you, even as I attempt to share some of my thoughts with you. Well, let me wish you all a Happy New Year to begin. This is a very auspicious beginning for 2018 for me. And let me also remind you, my colleague, Dr. Beatrice Smith, who's also my wife, as it happens to be, is happily here with me. And she's the author of a book called Reading and Writing in the Global Workplace, about outsourcing and the literacy practices and cultural somersaults, one might say, that the outsourcing regime of global capitalism causes. And also, her most recent book, just last fall, published, Collaborations and Innovations, about the situation faced by international students studying in American universities. And some of you may know some of these people. They have particular challenges that they face, and she's written about that in her most recent book. Well, I've got a PowerPoint here, and I got the title Postmodernism and Its Discontents suggested to me, and I found it quite congenial, so I began to think about that. But then Dr. Prasad emailed me and he said, well, could you say some more about cultural studies specifically? Because the students here have been engaged in a course on cultural studies, and I'm happy to do that. Cultural studies, from its very beginning, resisted, in some quarters at least, institutionalization. There was some fear, and I think a justified fear, that much of the force and the power of cultural studies would evaporate if it became an institutionalized, disciplinary, departmental structure. And it would become rigidified and lose its power of critique and innovation and agency. Nonetheless, it has congealed in various places to some extent, and there is a body that has become a kind of a canon of works that every one of us read, whether we're in South America or in North America or Europe or Asia. And yet there are interesting distinctions and differences to be made. And so one of the things I want to do today is to sketch out very simply and perhaps crudely a kind of a genealogy that leads us to the moment of cultural studies at this moment. The face of cultural studies, or the possibilities for cultural studies in 2018, briefly. And to do that, I'm going to begin rather broadly and talk about aesthetics in modernity. And what I'll mean by aesthetics is culture very broadly defined. All of the affective and cultural practices that become politically significant in modernity, in the development of the nation state. And so I want to do that, and then at the end I've got some kind of schematic diagrams in which I'll try to give an account of various different strands of influence upon cultural studies as we have now. I'll try to resist the temptation to launch right into that straight away. Well, this is what I have in mind, though, as that kind of simple history, beginning with the Earl of Shaftesbury, an English philosopher, writing just at the time of the emergence of the modern nation state, the emergence of republican forms of government in Europe, and the decline of absolute monarchies, and addressing the concerns among many of how people might govern themselves in the absence of divine authority. Kant later picks that up, and the Kantian framework of thinking about aesthetics, especially elaborated in his third critique, the critique of judgment, becomes a framework for succeeding philosophers and political thinkers and aestheticians to think about the role of aesthetics in a modern society. And it is a specific modern concern. Among those who interestingly developed Kant's paradigm for me, there are many more I could mention, but I'll mention Friedrich Schiller, a contemporary, or near contemporary of Kant's, who picked up Kant's ideas and tried to elaborate them, and maybe almost mistakenly produced some good mistakes in understanding Kant. Then Wilhelm von Humboldt, the designer of the modern German research model university, an important figure for me. Of course, Matthew Arnold you may have encountered before, Culture and Anarchy, and his concern that in mid-19th century Britain, things might fall apart with the decline of the church's influence if it weren't for having students to study literature. They could get a kind of a religious influence, he thought, from the literature. Then the emergence of the study of English literature, at least, and I guess other European literatures in the European universities. First, the study of philology, and this has a kind of an ethnocentric, nationalistic dimension to it, because these philologists, these 19th century linguists, were trying to trace the roots of English and German back to Sanskrit, for instance, and by doing so, they could sort of implicitly claim a warrant for the superiority of a long line of Western culture based on its very, very, very ancient roots and very honorable roots. So the study of literature I've written elsewhere and wanted to just introduce as a background today is very much associated with the development of the modern nation state and the felt need to produce a kind of a citizen subject who would be a proper subject, an effective subject, an effective citizen for the modern nation state, which is much different from the kind of a subject that would have been appropriate to a feudal state, a feudal economy. Then a field I'm closer to my home, I'm old enough to have been trained up in what was called American New Criticism, or in English, the Scrutiny movement, which tried to reject that historical focus of the 19th century philology and tried to reject Matthew Arnold's concerns about about training up recalcitrant young people into the mores and the values of the upper class. And instead, new criticism asserted that what we were focusing on is really the formal qualities, the excellences of the artistic, of the aesthetic artifact, the literary work. As it turns out, an awful lot of acculturation along the lines of what is needed for the particular nation state was also involved in new criticism, but it was kind of suppressed. So with having just given this kind of outline of a deep background, let me read a few pages that I've written to talk more about something leading to cultural studies and the importance of the aesthetic, very broadly defined, not just art criticism, but the ways that a society acculturates its citizens in order to get everyone to go along in a modern nation state. As Terry Eagleton points out in his book, The Ideology of Aesthetics, the linkage between aesthetics and politics appears in Britain in the wake of the glorious revolution of 1688. I guess I don't have a PowerPoint for that. When the monarchy was fully divested of its power and subordinated to the British Parliament. It was an era of excitement, tinged with some anxiety, with ideas about the possibility of self-government inspiring both hope and fear. In the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, the natural state of humans was to pursue narrow self-interest in a constant war of all against all, in a reasoned calculation to gain some measure of security for each individual. Individuals would sacrifice some of their freedom, ceding power to the state in order to protect themselves. Against this negative sense of freedom, the Earl of Shaftesbury, writing at the same time, proposes that there should be a Platonic ideal of moral beauty that would correspond to the aesthetic, which might evoke in the subjects an innate faculty of judgment, an innate faculty of moral judgment or taste as a positive force that bonds subjects together in a modern society. As it's described by Shaftesbury, taste turns out to be more or less indistinguishable from aristocratic manners and style, though now extended to the newly empowered bourgeoisie. This will be a community, in Terry Eagleton's words, and I'll give them for you here, in which the members are at once stoutly individual and also linked to their fellows by enlightened and social intercourse, and a shared sense of cultural manners. Assured enough of its political and economic stability, this governing bloc is able to disseminate some of its power in the forms of a general culture and civility, founded less on the potentially divisive realities of social rank and economic interest than on a common styles of sensibility and a homogeneous reason. A key factor in the political success of this bloc was that the bourgeoisie was eager to adopt aristocratic sensibilities. This quasi-aristocratic structure of feeling, to use the words of Raymond Williams, required a public sphere of coffee houses and newspapers in which political differences could be aired and debated. Social political consensus could be formed with the aesthetic guidance of writers like Joseph Addison and Richard Steele in the Spectator papers. In 18th century Britain, Terry Eagleton argues, moral standards were seen as absolute in themselves, yet to some extent diffused into the textures of personal sensibility, culture, and aesthetics. Taste was a more powerful statement of one's social belonging than either morality or ideology. Shaftesbury's aesthetic philosophy fuses beauty with truth. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I was about to say that the Earl of Shaftesbury's concept of the aesthetic fuses beauty and truth, if I can find my place again, into a harmonious whole. But Shaftesbury's conception of beauty is not an unrealizable ideal. For Shaftesbury, the beautiful artifact is characterized by a grace and a symmetry. In which the ideal may be seen, and the moral individual evinces the same grace and symmetry in social behavior. In Shaftesbury's vision of a republican political order, citizens will behave morally because to do so is aesthetically pleasing, rather than, as in Thomas Hobbes' view of the world, out of fear and rational self-interest. So the modern philosophical discourse of aesthetics, and I would almost say the modern understanding of our term culture, was from its beginnings about politics as well as about art. An underlying issue was the question of whether self-government, founded upon principles of truth and value, could be derived through rational processes. Alexander Baumgarten coined the term aesthetic, borrowed from a Greek original that referred to sensory perception, but Baumgarten used the term more specifically to refer to the spontaneous response to beauty, unmediated by rational judgment. In his doctoral dissertation of 1735 and in his later book, Aesthetica, Baumgarten distributed his arguments with examples from poetry, but his use of the term aesthetic had broader implications for problems of the constitution of the rational self and for republican self-government in the absence of divine authority. Baumgarten sought to identify a process of cognition based on perception that could supplement the conceptual logic of the Cartesian tradition. For Baumgarten, the aesthetic perception is both spontaneous and critical. On the one hand, aesthetic appreciation seems self-evident. Since it is spontaneous and produced by the sensory perception rather than logical thought, aesthetics response can function as a universe of solidarity among a community of like-minded perceivers. On the other hand, aesthetic response seems objective. Since it is critical and grounded in shared judgments of artifacts that are presumed to be objectively self-sufficient, aesthetic response can function as an ostensibly objective, if not precisely rational, basis for a hierarchy of values. In place of divine right, aesthetic discourse or taste offers a way to invoke something like a transcendental warrant for political authority in context where reason may fall short. It prefigures, in this way, the vague, undefined state of exception, so uncomfortable to contemporary constitutional states as theorized by 20th century political thinkers like Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben. Have some of you encountered writings on the state of exception, perhaps? If you haven't, I'd be interested in talking about it. Well, a few years later, Baumgarten's concept of aesthetics is picked up by Immanuel Kant. And in his critique of judgment, Kant picks up Baumgarten's thread that describes sensual perception as a source of experiential knowledge that complements conceptual knowledge. The opposition here is between experiential knowledge, what we feel and what we sense, as opposed to conceptual knowledge, which is presumed to be pre-existing, rational, logical, and derived through clear, pure reason. Our perceptions will be imperfect, but the spontaneity of recognition and the extent to which our perceptions are shared with others gives them a degree of validity. From this understanding of the subject's imperfect recognition of the object, Kant proceeds to the problem of how to arrive at a governing consensus when citizens can't be depended upon to come to agreement on the basis of reason alone. Aesthetics provides that discursive vehicle for him. Right-minded people will share a spontaneous recognition of the beautiful, particularly in experiencing natural phenomena, such as beautiful sunsets. These experiences will produce a pleasurable feeling that is not exactly the same thing as the direct sensual experience of the the direct sensual enjoyment of the experience, but instead is caused by a felt satisfaction in the experience itself, in that our consciousnesses are in harmony with nature. It feels good to feel good, and to recognize that your friends also feel good, having the same experience. That's the Kantian aesthetic. This structural factor also contributes to the sense that the aesthetic feeling is shared with others and that the feeling is perhaps universal. At fleeting moments, we will become vaguely aware of what Kant calls the sublime, something beyond beauty, something beyond sensory experience that we will sense is there, but we can't identify it specifically. This, for Kant, is rational, objective truth. Effectively, it's an intimation of pure reason, sort of a recognition of something that must be there even if we can't quite define it once and for all. In the end, for Kant, conceptual knowledge, the logical and the rational, confirms the truth beyond the aesthetic, and yet the truth can be approached through sensory perception, which is inevitably colored by emotion. Kant's attention to the political function of aesthetic perception established a framework, as I said earlier, for critical reevaluations of democratic governmentality that continues through the succeeding stages of modernity. But a number of recent theorists have returned to the thought of Kant's near contemporary, or his contemporary really, Friedrich Schiller, for a more complex articulation of aesthetics and politics. As Gayatri Spivak and others have noticed, in his Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, Schiller misreads Kant's critique of judgment in a way that gives a wider scope of political importance to the aesthetic experience. For Schiller, human consciousness is characterized by conflicting drives. One of these is a sense drive, that is the source of sensual experience and phenomenal perception. The sense drive is finite and physical, and the consciousness produced by it must be regulated by a form drive, which can be associated with absolute reason. That's Kant's sublime, really. Mediating between these completing drives of sense and form, for Schiller, is the play drive, which is the field of aesthetics. For Kant, sensual perceptions and aesthetic judgment remain subordinate to rational thought and conceptual knowledge, but aesthetics can provide access imperfectly to the sublime, or absolute reason. By contrast, in the processes of the play drive, Schiller's sensual perception engages on an equal basis with absolute reason. This mediatory preeminence introduces an element of contingency into the categories of human subjectivity, what it means to be human, how one becomes a citizen, and that anticipates a key concern now of postmodern theory. Our concerns with subjectivity, I think, can be traced back, elements of them, to Kant and Schiller. There's a genealogical connection between Schiller's robust field of aesthetics and the materialist accounts of human subjectivity that were to be developed by Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. In each of these thinkers, humans are constructions of material conditions and social processes, not Cartesian subjects discovering their own truths. Schiller also recognized in industrial modernity a tendency toward alienation and fragmentation of individual subjects and of communities that would be shared by the English Romantic poets, and also would become a theme of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, and the Frankfurt School, critical theorists, and among many others. Thus, Schiller's aesthetics belongs to a zeitgeist that makes a turning point in the trajectory of modern individualism. If we notice the emergence of modern individualism in the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, along with the rise of democratic citizenship, industrial capitalism, and mass society, we can recognize the decline of the modern individual in postmodern performative and contingent subjectivity, along with postnational cosmopolitanism, refugee nomadism, and post-industrial consumerism. From this moment forward, it will be increasingly difficult to uphold the concepts of autonomous individualism and a universal humanity in modernity. This can be asserted even while we have to acknowledge the powerful forces brought to bear precisely to promote the idea of individual autonomy. And I'll mention two of them here. First, these were quite often spectacularly and specifically aesthetic forces. For example, the literary form of the Bildungsroman. I don't know how many literature students are here. The Bildungsroman, the novel in which we see a young person facing some crises and struggles, and slowly and gradually developing into maturity and finding a way to assert a place in a place of agency in a modern democratic society. Further, the Bildungsroman also privileges a form of writing that cultivates this feeling of interiority. As we read the Bildungsroman, often we feel like we are the hero. We feel like this is happening to us. This could be me going through these struggles. This could be me finding my way. One irony is that these Bildungsroman heroes are usually young white men, and so that same position is preferred to women and to non-white people and people from all different classes. We all can be bourgeois subjects finding our way this way in the Bildungsroman. And I want to say that the emergence of this form as a preeminent literary genre of modernity can be explained as in a Derridian turn, following Jacques Derrida. The insistence is so strong, the opposite must be at least partly true. The individuality must be breaking down if we're insisting so much on how individualistic we are. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to proclaim it so loudly. So in modernity, the ideological contradiction between the tendency toward individualism and an opposing tendency toward normalization is reconciled symbolically in aesthetic response and functionally in the processes of Bildung, or the individual's acculturation. This reconciliation and modern society's confidence in the individual's capacity for self-knowledge and universal understanding has become increasingly difficult to sustain in late modernity, in postmodernity, after the advent of mass society and globalization and neoliberalism, all of those things. One other way, I'll just give you one other example of how Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man imagined or predicted or anticipated the political relevance of aesthetics, and that is in the system of higher education. Schiller's, another friend of Schiller and a contemporary of his, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who designed the German research model university that was later taken up in the United States and elsewhere, imagines a university that would produce this growing bourgeoisie. First, the agricultural and technical land-grant colleges in the United States, and then the extension of fields that previously would have been apprenticeship models, training by apprenticeship into the university, such as engineering, accounting, finance, banking, dentistry, medicine, and law. 150 years ago in the United States, attorneys were typically trained by apprenticeship and not in universities. This all is happening in the 19th century, and it's all part of the higher education infrastructure trying to produce, I think, this new human subject of modernity and to maintain it and sustain it through what is essentially, or I'm calling, a cultural or an aesthetic structure. They go back to Kant's conflict of the faculties, and I don't know if any of you have ever had occasion to read Kant's conflict of the faculties. I would recommend it, I suppose. It has a lot of meaning for me because 20 years ago, I was the president of the faculty union at Illinois State University. I've since moved on from there. But at that time, one of the interests of the union was to preserve the faculty's proper role in the life of the university, as against the administration. And Kant theorizes this relationship between the university's faculty and the university's administration all the way back at the turn of the 19th century. And there he posits two different forces, one within the faculty. One he calls the lower faculty. And the lower faculty for Kant consists of philosophy especially, but also the traditional liberal arts, even mathematics and those fields. The higher faculty for Kant in the German university would be the so-called vocational areas, the vocational subjects. And for Kant, this may sound counterintuitive and strange to you, but his primary example of the vocational higher faculty was theology. It may not sound so promising a field, at least in the United States, to enter for a career now. But that was Kant's idea of the vocational. And we would add, of course, medicine and law and engineering and surveying and banking and finance and those things. Well, Kant said, and I've got the quote up there, a part of it, that even though he calls philosophy, and by extension I would say cultural studies and literary studies and all of our liberal arts concerns, lower faculties, for him, lower is better, because the lower is more basic, more fundamental. And he argues that these lower faculties will from time to time have to correct the errors of these vocational faculties, these vocational subjects, in which the faculty are taking for granted, taking as self-evident values and perceptions and understandings of reality and history and culture and society and politics that are in fact narrow and limited and easily critiqued. So the lower faculty is the more important. Sadly for me as the union president, at that time, the lower faculty was paid less, and so we had a good reason to be doing our work. Well, so philosophy, in our current context, if we can broaden philosophy to include literary and cultural theory, and substitute the practice of critique for Kant's application of pure reason, this is a good description of our proper role in the humanities, or as cultural studies scholars and practitioners, and as cultural workers at large, in relation to the technical and vocational programs in the neoliberal, technocentric 21st century academy around the world, as I see it, not just in the metropole. Well, I'll skip over a few thinkers, if you'll allow me, and go directly to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's response to Schiller. Schiller's conception of the play drive of the aesthetic field as a field of mediation between sensual perception and pure reason can serve as a framework for understanding the politics of beauty from the post-romantic era to the post-modernity. No longer is aesthetic simply the gateway to the sublime, which is equated with reason, but now the aesthetic produces the truth. What we take to be true is produced contingently, constructed within the mediating forces of culture, such as, though, through its mediatory role between conceptual reason and perceptual sensation. Ironically, one way the political importance of the aesthetic manifests itself is by the aesthetic flight from politics, the celebration of art as a rejection of didacticism, moralism, and utilitarianism that echoes from the late Romantics through 19th century Bohemianism and l'art pour l'art, or art for art's sake, and all the way through to the Frankfurt School and, for instance, Adorno's mistrust of popular forms of art, such as jazz. He's quite wrong, I think, about the emancipatory potential of jazz and the critical potential of it. But he kind of assumed that it was too simplistic and that everyone needed to learn classical music, Western classical music, in order to develop a fully critical sensibility. This is kind of a manifestation of this Nietzschean perspective and of Schiller's paradigm. By the 1930s, with the emergence of mass society, along with photographs, phonographs, cinema, and broadcast media, it was clear, as Horkheimer and Adorno were to argue in their essay, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, that the Enlightenment dream of a citizenship of informed, effective political agency was faltering. Walter Binyamin, a Frankfurt School fellow traveler whom you may have encountered, responded to this. He analyzed how art and culture and ideology are functioning in late capitalism without prejudice against popular culture, as Adorno had. Binyamin recognizes that fascism succeeds in large part by a concerted plan of aestheticizing the political, remarking famously that fascism is the aestheticization of politics. Binyamin is especially prescient in his recognition of how the masses are enlisted vicariously into the scheme of glorification of the warrior leader. He writes, "All effort to render politics aesthetic culminates in one thing: war. War and war only can set a goal for mass movements on the largest scale while respecting the traditional property system." It goes without saying that the fascist apotheosis of war does not employ such arguments. Fiat ars pereat mundus, says fascism, and, as Marinetti argues, expects war to supply the artistic gratification of a sense perception that has been changed by technology. This is evidently the consummation of art for art's sake. Mankind, which in Homer's time was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, now is one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is the situation of politics in which fascism is rendered aesthetic. Communism responds by politicizing art. Now, I'm going to head toward a conclusion here by invoking an author, a thinker, whom who's relatively new to me, and that's Jacques Rancière, a French political philosopher who, back in the 60s, worked with Louis Althusser, but later criticized Althusser and moved away from Althusser's conceptualization of ideology. Jacques Rancière, interestingly for me, argues for a reversal of what Binyamin refers to as the fascistic model of aestheticization of politics. Rancière argues that the response must be to politicize aesthetics. And he doesn't mean simply to find a way to package some particular political program in an attractive way. He doesn't mean aestheticizing by ornamenting or advertising. He means interventions that create new models for a distribution of the sensible. These are his terms. Redistributions of the sensible in ways that extend equality to previously excluded members, people previously excluded from the polity, whether that's the nation state or the global transnational order or any community. So he's looking for ways to theorize interventions that will lead to democratization. And for Rancière, he wants to define democracy as synonymous with equality. Then, another distinction, and I know this, I'll just mention it in order to be faithful to him. I'm not sure how immediately useful it will be for our discussions. He wants to use the term the political in a very narrow way. And all of the things that we might ordinarily call political, he simply wants to call the police. And by police, he means, of course, Althusser's repressive state apparatuses, the coercive structures of society. And of course, he means Althusser's ideological state apparatuses, the educational system, the media, the church or synagogue or temple, all of those things. But those are all, he wants to call all of those things the police, Rancière does. And the political he wants to reserve for those acts of intervention that extend equality. That's the moment of the political. Those are the political acts. So he wants to redefine political really as revolution, always. If it's not revolution, it's not political for Rancière. And by revolution, I don't mean just violent overthrow of a particular government, but a redistribution of the sensible, a redistribution of sensibility. Now, this is exciting for me at this particular moment for more than one reason. One is that, happily, it gives us a big role, right, as cultural workers and professors in cultural studies and students in cultural studies and teachers of literature and social sciences, history and philosophy. Also, though, this is a moment of great need. In what I see, and I say this, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm being alarmist. This is a moment of resurgent fascism in lots of places, and not least in the United States. And so our work is cut out for us, and even though it's not quite clear right now what is to be done exactly, it is quite clear that something must be done, and we're in just the place, just the position to begin to do it. I'm going to skip over a page or two and see if I can find my place and pick it up where it will make some sense. For Rancière, this project of politicization, of politicizing the aesthetic, is specifically embodied in a pedagogical project. In a book entitled Le Maître Ignorant, the Ignorance Schoolmaster, he argued for a method of teaching that would not be premised on a hierarchy of knowledge between teacher and student. That notion, that equality, the notion that equality, or for Rancière, political emancipation, could be achieved by having students assimilate received knowledge of accepted masters, is a self-contradictory assumption. Rancière published this book in 1987. That's about the same time that I was really reading seriously and writing about these kinds of topics. That year, in an essay entitled The Subject Supposed to Know, in a book called The Pedagogical Imperative, Yale French professor Shoshana Feldman argued from a Lacanian perspective that the conventional model of cultural pedagogy is constructed in such a way that the student typically mirrors the instructor's knowledge rather than achieving a breakthrough of understanding. In 1991, maybe 1990, I may have my dates wrong. Professor Prasad could correct me maybe. I published an essay called Confrontational Pedagogy. And in that essay, I pointed out that the premise of the knowing teacher and the ignorant student was really problematic. Students come into the classroom with quite a bit of power and knowledge. It happens to be, most of the time, power and knowledge that I'm going to be disagreeing with. It's power and knowledge that they bring from their home communities, from their parents and their peers, from the media, sometimes from the fake news. I know which news that is. And they're bringing that into the classroom. And of course, as the teacher, as the professor, I have the power of the institution behind me. I have 8 years of advanced study beyond a bachelor's degree that gives me some credentials. And I'm 67 years old, so I have some authority of seniority. But they've got their parents, their peers, other students, their high school teachers who told them all the time that they have to study math and science so they can be engineers and make money, and authorities all the way from media to politics and everywhere telling them studying cultural studies is not important. It's a dead end. In fact, it's a net loss for you. So it would seem then that there are two forces at struggle in the classroom. Fortunately for me, I think they're rather outnumbered. My erudition and my skill and experience is a good match for 35 of them with all their parents and peers and high school teachers. But I have to tell myself that in order to not lose faith. So I'll conclude then after that remark, and then after this conclusion I'm going to pick up another PowerPoint and sketch this out graphically for you. Following Rancière's inspiration and the traditional inauguration by Kant and Schiller, I want to conclude with some remarks about aesthetic education, our work of teaching cultural studies. The ongoing cultural wars in the United States and elsewhere demonstrate that aesthetic perception and aesthetic discourse, that is, the production and distribution of art and cultural values, is a political force. Currently in the United States, we're constantly reminded of Binyamin's observation that fascism is the aestheticization of politics. We're reminded of that by our president, who manipulates the media with a with a relentless barrage of false statements and appeals to a substantial minority of the population with statements like the statements that espouse ethnocentrism, authoritarianism, militarism, and his reluctance to criticize the acts and politics of neo-Nazis within our society. I think we have something to gain by adopting Rancière's insight that if fascism is the aestheticization of politics, our proper goal is the politicization of the aesthetics. I do have a little bit more here, but I think that's a good place to end, and let me show you my diagram, so I'll do this. Oh, by the way, I forgot my clicker. There's Binyamin, and there's what Rancière looks like. Okay. So, if you can see this, that yellow large text there, Cultural Studies 2018. I want to propose several different trajectories. I think sometimes in the United States at least, when someone studies cultural studies, it's assumed that we must begin with Stuart Hall or Raymond Williams. We're beginning with British cultural studies, and that is a good beginning point. But some professors, and I could name names, maybe I won't just now, afterward ask me, will be very alarmed if you attempt to imply that strains of cultural studies came from elsewhere aside from Birmingham, not just Birmingham, although Birmingham was important. So I'll say, I'm going to see if I can move this around so I can look at my reminder. I'll say we could, of course, start with Kantian aesthetics. We could go back that far because of Kant's emphasis, as I'm wanting to read it, through Schiller, on culture as a mediatory field of political struggle. Then, from Kantian aesthetics, I would jump to Matthew Arnold, Arnoldian humanism. Have any of you encountered Culture and Anarchy by any chance? You might read it in a class on 19th century British literature. Then, jumping to the 20th century, in the United States, criticism. Yes. Oh, thanks. Thank you. Jumping to the 20th century, American New Criticism and in Britain, Leavisite scrutiny movement that I mentioned earlier. And finally, now, that's the tradition that Raymond Williams comes out of, and Richard Hoggart comes out of, and through them, Stuart Hall comes out of that tradition. Not only that tradition, but Stuart Hall comes out of that tradition. So that tradition leads directly to Stuart Hall and to British cultural studies. Then, a separate tradition, also eventually picked up by British cultural studies, but not really Arnoldian, and not really coming directly out of the scrutiny group or Williams and Hoggart. Those are all separate. We have the Frankfurt School, which became very influential. Another strand, then, Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, and the cultural materialism of Marxism and eventually psychoanalysis, and their influence on Gramsci and Althusser, on hegemony, the concept of hegemony developed by Gramsci, focusing on the acculturation or the formation of the modern subject, and Althusser's work on ideology and ideological state apparatuses, and then also coming into British cultural studies from that left wing there, left wing if I'm standing this way, Barthes, Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, and we could add some more names to that. Finally then, at the same time, two different points of influence, spontaneously and contemporaneously, the work from the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, writers like Angela McRobbie or a name is escaping me, who wrote Paul Willis, Learning to Labor. The book may not be read so much these days, but writers who began writing critical analyses of youth culture. In a way, these writers, Angela McRobbie and Paul Willis and some others, were kind of writing criticism of the Bildungsroman, only instead of writing about novels, they were writing about the actual social and cultural practice of British teenagers, right? So there are connections there. And then also cinema theory at the same time. And here I'm thinking, in terms of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham, the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, this is especially a group of French film theorists. Jacques-Alain Miller was one. Laura Mulvey, maybe some of you have read Laura Mulvey, another one, who are working out of a framework of Lacanian psycholinguistic theory and analyzing films and the history of film in that way. It's also influenced by Marxism, of course, and feminism, of course. So that all leads to British cultural studies in 1975. So, right? Then if we go later, at also about the same time, we have the Subaltern Studies Group, led by Gayatri Spivak, but also including the Latin American scholar John Beverly, and I don't know who else to add, Homi Bhabha, Radhakrishnan and others into that one. And at the same time, psychoanalytic and materialist feminism becoming more important in cultural studies because of the influence partly of the cinema theory people being developed. And now I want to add things that are important to me more recently. First, critical cosmopolitanism. Sometimes is used as new cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitanism from below. And this emerges, for instance, in the context of South American cultural studies in the work of someone called Walter Mignolo. I won't spell it, but so he has this view of cosmopolitanism in which you might think that cosmopolitanism is associated with Enlightenment universalism. The cosmopolitan is the colonial master who can travel all around the world and feel comfortable wherever he lands, and is sophisticated and erudite and super confident. Mignolo argues that the idea of cosmopolitanism, that we all should be comfortable with each other wherever we are, that everyone should be welcome and everyone should play a role, doesn't have to be restricted to the elite or to the former colonials, also to the former colonized. And so that's critical cosmopolitanism, and along with Walter Manolo, writers like Gerard Delanty, like Kwame Anthony Appiah from Ghana, other writers have developed that strand. And I would say now we're in the terrain of what could be very profitable threads to follow for cultural studies in 2018 and beyond. Also, we have to continue the work that's been being done on artificial intelligence, on social media, on the digital humanities, on technologization, and posthumanism. And there we get into the strain of, have you read Donna Haraway's Manifesto for Cyborgs, texts like that? Also more recent work out of Foucault's problematic of biopolitics and biopower, in the direction both of what it means to be human when we have smartphones and Siri and Facebook and Twitter, and what that does to our experience of being human technologically, not to mention chips implanted in our skins and so on like that, but also this gray area that I was a little bit slow to warm up to, of the boundary between humans and other animals. I'm getting there, and that's part of what we need to be looking at and are looking at, and then also biopower and biopolitics specifically, which include ecological criticism and the concept of the Anthropocene, which I didn't put up here, but I might well have done. And if some of these terms are unfamiliar to you, I'll be happy to give you my best understanding of some of them in a later interchange. So with that, I'll conclude, and let me see if I have I have one here, and invite you to raise questions or make comments, and look forward to it. Thank you all very much. Who would like for me to repeat something that I didn't pronounce very well? A particular term, maybe. Or look at a slide again. Any questions or? Let me ask which of you who are students have been in the cultural studies course I've heard about in that class? Yeah, thank you. Good, okay. She has questions written down. Yeah, good. Or maybe criticisms written down.
No, I want to know more about Rancière. You told about he moved away from Althusser. So I want to know more about him.
More about Althusser.
No, Rancière. Rancière.
Oh, Rancière. Oh, yes, Rancière. Yes, Rancière. Yes. In the 1960s, Rancière was writing alongside Althusser, and after the student demonstrations of May 1968, when Althusser failed to support the student strikes, even after the workers joined the streets with the student strikes. And by the way, if you don't know about those demonstrations in France in 1968, their motive was to extend access to higher education much more broadly in France. So that was just the sort of an intervention, a political intervention to extend equality to previously exploited people that Rancière is talking about here. And Althusser had a failure of nerve, even though Althusser was a member of the Central Committee of the French Communist Party. He didn't call out the unions and call out for supporters to join the students in the streets. And after the event, Althusser had a serious crisis of confidence, and that provoked him to write the Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses essay. Some of you probably read it. In that essay, he begins from the point of, why did I not act? Why did I miss this moment? And he kind of concludes that he was ideologically subjected, without thinking about it, to this comfortable position of being a kind of an elite academic in this society. And that leads him to think about the ways that people are subjected by ideological forces that are not coercive, they're not repressive, they're just very familiar. And as I was speaking with your colleague there, Karthik, last night in a discussion, very quickly, that's a very powerful problematic for critiquing an existing order. But the problem with Althusser for most followers is that he's so rigid in his suggestion of how we are overdetermined by ideology. He leaves no way in his mind for agency, no way to get out of that box of ideology. So Rancière is dissatisfied with that, as I am, and as most followers are. Nonetheless, if we stop and think about why Althusser's paradigm fails, one key reason, I think, is that at that time in the late 1960s, Althusser and other thinkers like him were framing their notion of subjectivity and of the polity in a way that was circumscribed by the nation state, by the Treaty of Westphalia. They were imagining the possibility of conflicting tensions and influences coming from without the nation state and on a global scale, and that's where much of the action has happened in the last 40 or 50 years. So if you read Althusser creatively and productively, I would say misread him in a productive way. I would say, sure, Althusser's, it's very valuable to acknowledge Althusser's very deterministic notion of ideology, but then to add ideology, in order to function in the way he describes it, has to reproduce that dominance at every moment in every space on the planet. And at every moment and in every space, there's a potential for that to begin to unravel, to lead to one of these moments of the potential politicization that Rancière is talking about. So I'm still learning Rancière. I came to Rancière late and might have not taken him so seriously because he writes very accessibly. He's a very good writer, and anyone who's a very good writer can be suspect of not being very smart. Right? He doesn't use bad syntax and complex, long, convoluted sentences and a lot of jargon, and so that makes him a little bit suspect. But overcoming that, I've been working through some of his work, and I'm still learning it. But I think I like the problematic that he sets for us at this moment, and the fact that he worked out of Schiller, like Gayatri Spivak and Terry Eagleton. They all invoke Schiller's work now, and also that he both worked with Althusser and then moved beyond Althusser. Thanks for that question. Another one, or a follow-up.
Sir,
Yes.
I would like to know more about Agamben and also about Foucault, his ideas of biopolitics and its contemporary readings.
This question is, what about Agamben's work, the concept of bare life, and also these other biopower and biopolitics scholars working out of the problematic that Foucault inaugurated, kind of as an afterthought in his book on the history of sexuality. That's right. In a chapter called "Society Must Be Defended," in which he argued that the importance of this is that it gets us beyond what was called the discursive turn, or the discursive framework. That framework that is shorthand characterized by Derrida's proclamation, "There is nothing outside of the text." Have you heard that proclamation by Derrida? Derrida famously says, all of our consciousness, as far as it's all a big text, it's all about language. Now that's really powerful, as long as you don't take it literally. But some people would want to take it literally and just say, well, he's not talking about reality. He's just talking about what's in people's heads. But as I've always taken Derrida, when he says there's nothing outside of the text, of course there's a real world. The only way we can have access to that real world, going back to Kant, is through our projections of sign systems onto our sensual perceptions. We can never know a cat in its essential being of catness. We can only know it as something that looks kind of cute or kind of disgusting or something that would be good to eat or something that makes us sneeze, me in particular, right? That's not the essence of catness. That's our understanding of it, right? So that's where to take Derrida. So Agamben and Foucault, working out of what Foucault inaugurates with that essay, that short essay, is a bunch of thinkers who began to rethink the body and sensory physical experience of the nervous system and flesh and all of that, not in a biologically essentialist way, not in a way that leads to biological determination or biological essentialism that says that life is just life and that's all there is, but as life as it is inscribed by language, sign systems, and consciousness. And that's what Agamben does, text of writings on governmentality, how a nation state or a political organization encourages and enforces even assent and consensus without using repressive force. Those are the ones to look at, and at least for my part, it was more valuable to me to wait for a few years till other people could explain Agamben in a way I could understand it. So that's Agamben. I'm sorry, you asked the question, yeah. And then you mentioned Foucault. Another writer who's kind of distasteful to a lot of people in this vein is someone called Carl Schmitt. And Carl Schmitt was a German political philosopher who was an apologist for Hitler. But nonetheless, he was he's kind of like Nietzsche, you know, and that Nietzsche says a lot of really hateful things, or things that could be taken as hurtful and insensitive. But he's insisting on the truth. Carl Schmitt is kind of like that. He was an apologist for Hitler, but his key insight was that there's a moment in any constitutional republic when the Constitution has to be violated and set aside in order to protect the Constitution. And in the American context, one of those moments, for example, I would invoke was Abraham Lincoln's invocation of martial law during the American Civil War. He had to say to those southern states who wanted to secede, I'm sorry, you just can't do that, and we'll go to war to stop you. You just can't leave. Or another more recent one I'll invoke was President Obama's decision to use drones to kill terrorists in other countries, and sometimes innocent people would be killed with those drones. But the one that really violates the American Constitution was one particular case where there was a terrorist who was an American citizen living, I think, in Yemen, and President Obama authorized a drone killing of that American citizen. And that is absolutely against the American Constitution. That American citizen, even though he was a terrorist, had the right to a trial by jury and of peers and the due process. So Agamben and Schmitt and these workers out of biopower and governmentality are part of this whole mix of where cultural studies needs to go, I think, in 2018 and beyond. Thanks for that question. Some other questions or comments? Yes. Oh, he needs a microphone.
Sir, my question is about, I was thinking about Friedrich Nietzsche's definition regarding truth. So when you look into the Romanticism, Keats says beauty is truth and truth is beauty. Yeah. So, but Nietzsche says truth is ugly. So I would like to know about why Friedrich Nietzsche particularly defined truth is ugly, and under the which context he says truth is ugly.
Yes.
So I would like to know about that, sir.
I love that question, and I have 5 pages on it that I cut out here. So I'll try to condense it very quickly. When Keats says truth is beauty, beauty is truth, and that's all you know on earth, and all you need to know, is Keats being serious, or is he making fun of us? It's hard to tell, because it's such a tautology. It answers itself by answers the question by asking the question backwards, right? When Nietzsche says truth is ugly, he, of course, is responding to Kant and to John Keats and to Schiller and all those writers who assumed that beauty was self-evident, and we would all agree on beauty. And one thing that Nietzsche is saying is that ugliness is beautiful. That you can't quite make this. The distinction is contingent. It's historically contingent. It's politically contingent. It will be perceived differently by different people. And then Nietzsche will go on to say, this ugliness, if you can face it, you can make it beautiful by owning it, by commanding it, by mastering it, by becoming the overman who has passed through this hard recognition that life is not just fun and games, but that now I have been acculturated, I've been interpolated in Althusser's terms as a subject, and I'm above all that. And then Nietzsche will go on to proclaim that the overman, having passed through all that, now can break whatever laws he chooses, is a law unto himself, and can just do whatever he wants. So I invoke Nietzsche here more especially because of, along with Freud and Marx, he's a landmark in the recognition of the social construction of subjectivity and the material construction of subjectivity. The idea that we know we are human not because God has given us a soul and not because we have a rational thinking mind like Descartes says, but simply because we have been the subject of these social forces that train us up to be human. And just to elaborate that slightly, Eagleton somewhere writes something that's very good for me. He writes that humans of all animals are born more immature, more premature than any other animals. Most other animals in a few months will be able to live by themselves. A human is going to take 7 or 8 years probably to be able to live on one's own without a parent or a guardian, right? That 7 or 8 years is this period of indoctrination in all sorts of ways, and that's obvious, in gender constructions and class constructions and all sorts of ways. So that's what Nietzsche is saying. Okay, he says, we have to pass through that. For most people, that will make them part of the herd. You're just going to go through life as an automaton. And Nietzsche says, if you want to get beyond that, to be a radical individual, someone for whom there is no law, you can do that, but you have to recognize that truth is ugly in order to do that. Now, at the same time, Marx is taking that same insight and saying, really, it would be better if we could all just get along, and we would be happier if this were a society, if we could produce a society in which these hierarchies could be destroyed or at least minimized as much as possible. Nietzsche's going exactly the opposite direction from the same premises, I think. Thanks for that question.
Thanks.
Critiques of Derrida, Foucault, Barthes, Lacan, all of these post-structural writers, Althusser, saying this argument that truth is contingent and that you can't depend on reality, this is going to lead us to terrible consequences. And they were absolutely right in the 1970s to say that. The problem was, I think, and I found at the time, you could make the critique, but you couldn't posit some response that could be effective in overturning this trend. And so if you simply made the critique and assumed that the critique would stop the advance of postmodernity in its tracks, you were sadly mistaken. You had to keep trying to understand it, to figure out how postmodernity, neoliberalism, globalization, and all of these things were unfolding, to keep looking for moments of potential intervention. This may not be it, but this has led me to the current moment and to Rancière as at least asking the right questions and posing the right framework for for trying to respond to late modernity and late capitalism and the current moment of globalization and neoliberalism and postmodernity, even though that term is becoming passé. So I take the tone of your question to mean this is a kind of a quixotic gesture, a quixotic a kind of a task, and I have to agree, but it's the best one I can see just at the current moment out of cultural studies. Framework in that book. Specifically, I can't remember how he posited sublimity, but I'll go on to say, to make a recommendation that I can say enthusiastically and without any qualms, and that is about the same time that I read Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, which was written as a report asked for by the Canadian higher educational system. There was another book published by David Harvey called The Condition of Postmodernity, published almost simultaneously, about the same time. If any of you encountered that book, David Harvey is a Marxist geographer, and he's still teaching, I think, at Johns Hopkins University, and he's written many other books. But if you've read Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition and found it inspiring and significant and engaging, let me invite you also to go back and read David Harvey, The Condition of Postmodernity, at the same time. And here's what I find better in Harvey than in Lyotard. That is that Lyotard is working at the conceptual level, the abstract level, the level of intellect and philosophy and the life of the mind. Harvey connects all of those things to art and architecture and industrial practices and daily life, very systematically and very specifically, and also much more historically specifically than does Lyotard. For instance, Harvey goes back to give a very good analysis of Fordism, not just as a regime of production, but as a cultural phenomenon, and also post-Fordism. Later, by the way, that will be picked up, that concept of post-Fordism from Harvey will be picked up by Negri and Hart in the Empire trilogy, Empire, Multitude, and Commonwealth. So I can't specifically remember what Lyotard says about sublimity, but I kind of suspect, remembering what I do, about the contrast between Lyotard and David Harvey, writing about postmodernity just at the same time, that his concept of sublimity is probably closer to Kantian than Harvey's is, and maybe closer to Kantian than I would want to subscribe to. Is often quite simplistically understood. And so for Marx, it was an inescapable consequence of and associated with capital. It wasn't something that was an error that could be avoided in any case. So, and the money form is really the ideal and quintessential fetish there. It still and will exist as long as there is a money economy. There will be commodity fetishism. It's inescapable, so it's a little bit like Althusser's ideological interpolation, but it can be understood and resisted and managed, I think. So briefly, that's my answer. I will say that these current writers on biopolitics and biopower are arguing, and Rancière also is arguing, that now commodity fetishism has most principally become the fetishization of ourselves as commodities. We are only worth what we are worth on the market, and we're encouraged to wear these particular clothes and so on to an extent much greater than had been done in previous regimes of production and previous eras of modernity. And so these writers on biopower and biopolitics are trying to describe an insertion of our subjectivity into the regime of commodity production in a way that is categorically different from simply being a subject who is fetishizing commodities unavoidably, now to having been kind of inserted to the whole regime of the system as a commodity ourselves, like these others. That's probably a good place for me to stop, since I'm afraid I might say something I disagree with if I say something further. Thanks for the question. I think Dr. Prasad has a... Are we finished, or should we do one more?
Good morning, everyone. And I'm supposed to propose the vote of thanks. And as he has to catch the 12:30 train, I'm supposed to be quick. And I would use this opportunity to formally thank Professor Ronald Strickland for coming here and giving us an introductory insight to cultural studies. Thank you, sir. And also to Beatrice Smith, his partner. We had I'd also thank her both of them personally, because we had wonderful conversations last day. And I also